Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. The 2023 Giving Report by Canada Helps begins with a stark headline: It's time for change. The report goes on to outline alarming challenges facing the nonprofit sector, including unprecedented demand for services, falling donations, staff mental health issues and burnout, and rising inflation. We've also seen reports of a disturbing decline in public trust in the nonprofit sector and a continuing reckoning of nonprofits and charities to embrace diversity and inclusion from leadership to frontline workers. To help us understand the challenges and explore solutions, please welcome Pam Uppal, Director of Policy at the Ontario Nonprofit Network. Welcome to the podcast, Pam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Mary. Happy to be here.
Well, the Canada Helps Giving report released earlier this year showed a very stark situation for nonprofits nationally who are facing higher demand for service, lower funding, rising inflation, staff turnover and burnout, and a crippling lack of volunteers. What's the data telling us about how nonprofits are faring in Ontario?
Not quite different. And so we had a pretty stark headline for our survey as well this year, which was we're at a tipping point. Ontario's nonprofit and charitable sector is at a tipping point. And so to give you a bit of context around that, so we do an annual State of the Sector survey every year. And honestly, when we started during the pandemic, we didn't think it was going to become annual, but the need has been such. It's become more important than ever to really better understand how the sector is faring and how a lot of these broader public policy, social, economic contacts that you have already mentioned impact our sector, the work that we do, our operations, our funding, and all of that. And so this was actually our fourth annual State of the Sector survey. This was the first time we weren't asking people about the pandemic, and we were shifting a bit more towards continuing to ask about finances, but HR, volunteering, and sort of thinking about what's happening next. And we were a unique opportunity where we were able to do a 4-year analysis. So we had 4 years worth of comparable data from 2020 to 2023, 4 different surveys to really tell a story about the sector, a story that takes us from the height of the pandemic to now being a year to 2 years out of almost restrictions being lifted and pandemic supports ending. And just to give you a sense that we had about 1,400 respondents across the province. Our survey is open to anyone who identifies as a charity and or a nonprofit, grassroots group, unincorporated, really to get a diversity of the sector. And so when looking at the 4-year trends, there's like a couple of things I wanted to highlight. First one was the demand piece, which Charity Insights touches on. We've also seen demand for nonprofit profit services at an all-time high over the 4-year period. It's grown 29% since 2020, and right now we're sitting at about 76% of the sector saying that they've experienced an increase in demand for services. The second piece has been around nonprofit financial situations. So those are on a downward spiral. And it's a bit more complicated when you're looking at 4 years worth of data. It's not as linear, this is going down and this is going up. But what we've seen is when you put all those data points together, it points to a very particular story. So even though, over the past couple of years, we've seen at least half the sector, less than half, about 40% of the sector report some sort of marginal increase in revenue, that has not kept pace with the increase in demand for services, which we just talked about, and the rising expenses and costs. So expenses and costs are 90% of the sector this year had reported that they experienced some sort of rise and increase of expenses and costs. And so that coupled with increase in demand for services, whatever sources of revenue we're seeing go up is not sufficient. And those two pieces are definitely outpacing revenue growth. The other piece I want to really, emphasize in this space is that whoever reports an increase in revenue, so even though aggregate numbers point to 40% of the sector reporting that, they're usually larger organizations, right? The smaller ones are more likely to report a decline in revenue. So we're sort of seeing that fissure in who's experiencing gains and who's not in the sector for sure. The other piece has been, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. Please continue.
I was just gonna say, reserve funds are also something important to keep in mind. So we ask every year if folks are accessing their reserve funds, and that was the case again in this year's survey. And over the past 4 years, more and more are accessing their reserve funds. Good news is more have reserve funds, so that number of we don't have a reserve fund has definitely gone down, but more are also accessing theirs. And then the other couple of trends I wanted to highlight was around the HR crisis. So the HR crisis continues. We started measuring and measuring that last year, and it was at a very high level crisis. And what I mean by that is last year, 65% of the sector reported issues with recruitment and retention. It's exactly the same number this year. Nothing's changed. So that's plateauing at quite a high and significant level. And then when we think about who is really experiencing that, a lot of the larger organizations, a lot of our Black-led, Black-serving, Black focus or Indigenous-led focus service partnership organizations, 2Ls LGBTQI plus organizations, all of them have reported, that they're not able to recruit and retain staff. And actually, the same has been true for the demand and service and financial situations as well. And then moving into just the impact of all of this. So we also measure and have been measuring what's sort of been the impact around, if you have HR crisis, demand is going up, financial situations cannot keep up. And one way we've measured over the past 4 years is knowledge of nonprofit closures. It's definitely very hard to keep track of what's closing and what's not. So we ask survey respondents to say yes or no if they know of a similar organization in their network that has shut down over the last fiscal year. And at this in this year's survey, 35% of organizations said they knew someone that had shut down in their subsector, their area, their region, their network, which is at an all-time high, higher than the height of the pandemic. And that's something really, really to think deeply about, because when one closes, even though it might be one here and one there, we know that that creates a huge gap in our social safety net, and it kind of reinforces the other trends, right? So now you have a community, no matter how small, that isn't getting serviced anymore. So perhaps it's being picked up by surrounding, or they're not getting service at all. And if it's being picked up by the surrounding organizations, they probably don't have the staff, the funding, or the resources to provide those services, which creates the burnout, which creates more difficulty retaining and recruiting staff, and where you see the increase in demand go up, but nothing sort of keeping up with that.
Yeah, that's so concerning because it obviously exacerbates dramatically the demands on nonprofits in Ontario. One of the most alarming things that you alluded to, and also coming out of the reports this year, is the sharply rising demand in services that nonprofits and charities are facing, particularly since, as you say, donations and funding are not keeping pace. What are your thoughts on the reasons for this complex issue?
Hmm. Definitely something we've been contemplating and thinking about quite a lot. And actually, we've had the privilege of going into 6 different communities this past year and hosting regional events where we invite nonprofits in the area to come gather. We share information and sort of see, what's happening on the ground. And everyone across the board, regardless which region you're in, what subsector you're part of in Ontario, you're facing an increase in demand for services. Couple of reasons why I think this is happening. One is we know that folks during crises, folks rely on nonprofits. People, more and more are turning to nonprofits to navigate a lot of the complex social issues that they're facing. And we've seen this really happen during public emergencies. So during the pandemic, lots of increase in demand for service. Then during climate emergencies, wildfires, floods, people are turning to the local Red Cross or their food bank or shelters, evacuation sites. And then we also see this when there's a massive affordability crisis happening, not just in Ontario, but across the province. So that sort of sets off the other pieces, the food banks, the shelters, the mental health and addiction supports, the family services supports, the gender-based violence supports. And so all of that, is at an all-time high, which I think everybody knows. The other sort of component to the increase in demand for service is we're also we're trying to fill gaps in places where no one else can, where government's not there or for-profits can't step in. Affordable housing, developing affordable housing. That's definitely in our space too, and that's needed more than ever. Settlement services, new immigrant settlement refugee services, that's all delivered by our sector too. And we know immigration numbers are also at an all-time high across Ontario and the province as well. So a lot of these things are what's sort of creating demand. The other trend that's been really interesting, particularly outside of perhaps Toronto and the GTA, is the migration and movement of people into mid-sized cities outside of Toronto and the GTA. So I'm talking Windsor, London, Kitchener, Waterloo. I'm talking about Ottawa, and if we even go outside of Ontario, thinking about Calgary, Edmonton, people are moving in large numbers to these places, and they're leaving Toronto, they're leaving the GTA, and what that's doing is sort of creating an increase in demand on the social infrastructure, which nonprofits are a big component of in those areas, because the social infrastructure isn't keeping up to meet demand of all these people that are moving in. And so that's something definitely to think about, right? When we see this migration and immigration patterns within the province and in Canada across different provinces. And then the other piece has been what's been really interesting for us to think about as we've been doing analysis is that we're at the whims of our context much more than other industries are, right? Because arguably, every industry is facing a labor shortage, or every industry is bearing the brunt of increased inflation or an HR crisis. And so, what makes us different is what we're asked quite often. And what I would say is that when there's there's austerity and government money, and there's decreased spending, that means for us that our funding is going to go down, right? Our funding is going to get flatlined. If there's economic uncertainty, there's global geopolitical uncertainty, instability, etc. That means charitable giving is going to go down. And for us, that's a big impact, right? Or volunteerism might go down, which is connected to charitable giving. As I mentioned before, if there's an affordability crisis or inflation is up or anything like that, that means our services are going to go up. But that also means we're also going to bear the brunt of costs going up. So we sort of see it on both ends, which perhaps might not be the case for many other. So we can't control our context as much as perhaps other industries can do. And just to sort of end that piece around, so what happens? So what if a nonprofit closes, and so what does that mean for everybody else? If a nonprofit closes and we're not servicing something in community, that means demand in other parts of the system, like hospitals, long-term care, institutions, jail, treatment centers, are going to go up because we're on the front lines and we're trying to do preventative and reactive work on the front lines. And if that's not happening, that's where sort of then you'll see the demand go, which is very costly, inefficient for governments.
Well, it sounds like a perfect storm, Pam, that you have such great insight into. The Canada Helps Giving report, as well as your own reporting and analysis, discusses staff turnover and burnout, which are causing an HR crisis in the sector, as you described. Can you talk about this in more detail and how it's impacting individual nonprofit staff as well as nonprofit leaders and organizations as a whole?
Yeah, for sure. And as I shared, we've been measuring the HR crisis for a couple of years now, since like the end of 2021, which is when we started to really see this moment be different than other moments in terms of recruitment and retention in the sector. And we started measuring it in our survey last year. And so the number has stayed the same. 65% of the sector is still experiencing recruitment and retention issues. And when we ask, what are the top factors? Exactly the same as last year: staff burnout and stress, compensation packages are the top two pieces around being able to recruit or retain people. This year, we actually asked a couple of new questions, and one of them was turnover. And we asked, has anyone left your organization? Have you experienced turnover this year? And 77% of our respondents reported some sort of turnover this past fiscal year. And so we also wanted to know, so where are people going? If they're leaving our sector, what are they doing? Or where are they working? And so those responses have been really interesting. In Ontario, the response rate was 37% said that their workers were leaving for another nonprofit for the same or similar job. So we're competing amongst each other labor and for to pay the best and to have decent work conditions. And then 36% were leaving for the public sector for the same and similar job, which we know is an issue. Oftentimes same funding portfolio for whether you're a nonprofit, municipal school board or hospital, or for profit if you're in that space. And nonprofits get less money than the other two, and that means our wages are lower. So you could be a childcare worker, a PSW, a DSW, and homeless worker, and our sector you'd get paid less, wherein you could do the same job, same qualifications in the other two sectors and get paid much more, significantly more. And we're calling that a wage parity issue. And then we're seeing that happen. If people are leaving our sector, they're going to go work in the public sector for the same job. And this, of course, varies really depending on region and subsector as well. These are some the provincial averages, and these are the top two. But depending on the demographic makeup or that community, it might mean that people are retiring. It might mean that there's a new manufacturing plant or something that's opened up that's definitely paying more, so they're going there. And it's something really to think about, because no one has calculated, I think, in our sector, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the true cost of staff turnover and burnout. We know it happens. We see it every day. There's staff disconnection, there's low morale. Folks that are still on the team have to pick up extra work. If you're on the front lines, you're experiencing vicarious trauma. There's lots of compassion fatigue, especially if you're asked to do more and help more with much less. And the work is hard. If you're getting paid minimum wage to help people find housing, but you can also get paid minimum wage to work at McDonald's, what's easier, right? And so we're definitely seeing some of that. And I think one thing we also have to remember that our staff isn't separate from the communities that we serve. So they're also experiencing the affordability crisis, right? One of the things that we're noticing in the big city centers is an exodus of staff in those areas. They're not living where they're working anymore. And sometimes a lot of the demand and increase for service, like to meet that demand, sometimes comes at the expense of our workers. Take on that one more client, just work that extra 2 hours, because sometimes it is a life and death matter. And how do you say no to that? And I would say it's not just frontline. I think everybody in the sector, regardless if you're a board member, senior leader, middle management, everyone's experiencing staff and burnout because the issues are so important and the issues are so alive and so front and center, and there's so much uncertainty. And we are really doing a lot with not a lot of support and resources, which can really be difficult.
Well, I know that ONN has for years now been an advocate of what you call decent work. Can you tell us about what decent work looks like and why it's so important to the sector? You certainly already outlined a great reason why it might be. Maybe you could explain the concepts that you've been
Mm-hmm.
exploring.
Yes, for sure. So I'm actually really excited to say, at ONN, we've been building a decent work movement in the sector for almost last 10 years. This is quite a long time. And really we took, for some folks listening, it's not a new concept. We borrow it from the International Labor Organization, where decent work means fair, stable, and productive work, so that it's a source of dignity. It really brings together this concept of work, of labor, with social protection, dignity, benefits, pension, fair wages, productivity, all of those pieces together. And as I shared, we've been doing this for the past 10 years, and it's taken a lot of different iterations. We had part of the movement building was really looking at it from a gender-based intersectional lens. What does decent work for women mean, and what does that sort of unearth, and how do we build that, particularly if we're a sector of 77% women? We've also talked about decent work and volunteerism. Volunteerism can't replace employees and workers, but volunteers are so important and critical to the work that we do. Our board of directors are usually volunteers, right? And then over the past iteration of our decent work movement building, we really centered reconciliation, anti-Black racism, really thinking about what does decent work for our Indigenous workers and our Black workers in our sector look like, and how do we really think about questioning and challenging white supremacy in our cultures at work. And so a bunch of resources around that have been created as well. What I will say is that this moment that we're in right now is so interesting because the pandemic has really forced people to rethink what their relationship to work is. And by default, what their relationship and their expectations of their employers are. And I think that's sort of the tensions that we're seeing. People are questioning internally, what type of work do I want to do? What gives me motivation, self fulfillment? What sort of fits the lifestyle I want to live? They're questioning the quality of their jobs. They want good work. They don't want to just work for minimum wage and precariously and perhaps, not have a pension to retire on. And their expectations of employers to meet those demands are valid and are coming up more and more. And we're seeing that happen, not just in our sector, across the sector. And I think employers are struggling to keep up, nonprofit employers are struggling to keep up at times at the pace of the workers, while, trying to keep their organizations afloat and all of these other things are happening. And so we are seeing in our sector workers want decent work. They want better wages, better benefits, flexibility. Now, hybrid work models are really, really important, especially folks that are caring for children, long term stability, pensions. You want to retire on a pension. It's no longer a hope, or maybe we'll have it someday. And that's great because that's what the goal of the decent work movement was, both from an employer and employee perspective. We wanted to empower workers to demand better for themselves, but also really equip the sector as an employer with all the things they would need to be able to make that happen and really talk about the value around that. Because as I shared, we're competing with each other, but we're also competing against many, many other industries for workers. And although, we've always been able to rely on the mission and vision, passions alignment, values alignment for people to work in our sector, that might not be enough in the future when many other places might start offering that too.
You speak about how you'd like to support employers, and you recently launched some new decent work resources for organizations. How can these resources help nonprofit leaders make changes in their organizations to better support their staff?
There are so many resources. So I really do encourage people to go check out our website, www.theonn.ca, because as I shared, we've been doing this work for the past 10 years. And so we've really built an evolving suite of toolkits, resources, guides that folks can rely on. And it really is about, it's really meeting where nonprofits are at in their decent work journey. If you're just at the beginning, you're trying to figure out what this would look like, there's a decent work charter and a checklist to sort of guide you through that. If you really want to look at it from a gender based intersectional lens, we have a guide on setting up compensation practices with a gender equity lens. We have information on parental benefits and maternity leave benefits. And more recently, as I was sharing, we have our decent work pathways that has come out. And this really thinks about and centers equity, really. So the 8 different pathways to not just achieve equity, but to achieve equity in your organization with a decent work lens. So really making sure you're supporting and lifting and creating positive workplace cultures for your Black and Indigenous workers in our sector and questioning some of those pieces as well. We've also translated a bunch of stuff into French. So a lot of bilingual resources are available online too. And what I'll say is that, again, there's something for everyone where whichever part you're at, whichever part of the journey you're at, and that it's not a commitment that requires money. It's right away. It's a commitment that is about how do I make my workplace better and safer and more accessible for workers and our employees and whoever's going to come back in. And it's such a critical recruitment and retention tool. We did do another new question in our survey this year because what we were noticing were that the sector was kind of not waiting to get more funding really to fix some of the recruitment and retention issues, but really we're trying to implement some of their own strategies. So we asked, what are some strategies that you're implementing? Across the board, everyone's implementing flex or hybrid work models. Some are raising compensation and mental health and well-being. Those were the top 3 things that people are focusing on. And so that kind of energy, I think, is really important. Although the issues we're facing are systemic in nature, and so we have to do both the systemic advocacy work, so we're not funneling people into low-wage jobs, quite frankly, but also what is in our control. How can we really create safe, decent workplaces in our sector?
So we've been talking about, as I've described it, a perfect storm of issues facing the sector right now, and they seem so incredibly large for one organization or one board of directors or an executive director to take on all by themselves. Does the sector need more collaboration to get through these difficult times? I know ONN has been a real leader in this, but tell us what can be done by working together as organizations and individual leaders do a better job at collaborating and not competing.
Yes. So that's our whole network model that we approach our work. It's how ONN is structured. It's how we approach our policy work or network engagement work or comms. It's all network based. And what network based is, we're not the experts. We don't know everything. And that we're stronger together if we're all sort of advocating collectively, coordinated, we're connected, we're sharing information across the different parts of the network. And in this case, it would be the nonprofit sector in Ontario and even across the country. Actually, we're sharing, we're connected, we're relying on each other, we're building trust. That means we'll be stronger together, and that's how we can really move on a lot of the systems change work. It's not going to be one leader, it's not going to be one organization or board member. It really will, to see this sort of level of change we want to see, systems change that we want to see, it would take everyone. And that's not to say that collaboration and collective advocacy isn't already happening. I think the sector, what I find exciting, and I've only been in the sector maybe for like 10 to 12 years at this point, but it's not the same as it was 2, 5, 7, 10 years ago. And I think that's been one of the great gifts of the pandemic, where the sector really started to come together even more to connect and collaborate and collectively advocate, because they saw what was happening in communities and knew that there was no option. But also the results of it, right? There was lots of really, really great supports that came out of that. And I think now folks know it's not an option to not connect, collaborate, and share information and do advocacy together. And the other piece that's exciting is that the sector is evolving, it's changing, it's growing, it's maturing. So we have a whole new generation of folks that are engaging and leading in the sector from diverse communities, from different perspectives, and they're sort of really pushing that too. A great gift out of the pandemic, that there was no option. We had to come together to because we saw what was happening in communities. And this is not just happening in Ontario, but I had the privilege of being part of a regional nonprofits network meeting in Ottawa earlier this month, which is all about sort of similar organizations as ONN across different provinces and territories, nonprofit networks coming together to sort of share, connect, collaborate, which we've been doing over the past many, many years. But this was our first in-person meeting since the pandemic, and talking about what's next. How do we really work together to bring the systems change that we want to see, not just in Ontario or BC or PEI, but in Nunavut as well, right? Or in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and what can we learn from each other? And that there was so much energy in that room, so that's really exciting.
Hmm. What do you feel is the government's role in addressing some of these very complex challenges facing the nonprofit sector today? Is the sector doing enough to advocate for itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our whole mandate, mission and mandate, is about creating an enabling public policy environment for the sector in Ontario. So really wanting to create an policy environment where nonprofits can do the work that they do best in communities on the ground. There's definitely room for governments to step up at all levels to continue supporting the sector, acknowledging and recognizing how important the sector is in building and creating communities and where people want to live. I mean, housing is such an important issue right now, and it's all about where people want to live. And part of that is the sector. The childcare spaces, the parks and recreation spaces, the elder care that's available and accessible. Everything's high quality, low cost, and affordable. All of those pieces are from the sector. And so, really wanting to stress that we're already allied to government, we're on the ground, and that a lot of the other big social complex issues that the province and the feds are attempting to solve, that we can help with. We know what's happening in communities. We usually are the first ones who knows. We're cost effective. We get things done, faster. We're more agile, and there is a nonprofit difference, right? We have a volunteer board that comes from the community. We're accountable and transparent to community, no matter what the issue is or the niche, a need that pops up, regardless if you can make money off of it or not. Nonprofits will service it. And really thinking about the um, public assets and public hands component. If we own real estate or if we own something, it's not going to get privatized one day and then disappear and not be open to the public. It's once we own it, it's always going to be in the public's hands. If we want to dissolve, we have to sell to another nonprofit or charity. And I think these pieces are really important, in which we would love to keep stressing to the province and the government, the federal government, in when thinking about what they can do more to sort of support that, to continue making sure that we can do the work that we do on the ground.
In BC, there is, in a certain form, a home in government for the nonprofit sector with a parliamentary secretary for community development and nonprofits. Has there been any movement on creating a home in government in Ontario?
First of all, it's amazing to see BC have that, and we've seen some really, really great impact pieces come out of that. So really, kudos to our BC counterparts who have helped shape that. And I think there has been movement here in the sense, there's a bit more recognition of why a home in government for Ontario's nonprofit sector would be valuable, and not just, and I think across the board, like from public servants to political components, and also the sector. And for the reasons that I was just stressing before, we're so important in creating healthy communities. We're an economic driver and we're a ready ally. So we need someone in cabinet to champion that, to connect the dots, to really sort of bring forth the perspective of the sector, and work across with the whole government of whole of government approach. And so I think people are starting to gravitate towards that and understand what that might mean. We're not looking to replace existing, relationships folks have with their own ministries, et cetera, or, create another sort of bureaucratic red tape to doing the work, but rather streamline and create a space in which we can go to and have someone champion us. Very similar to, if you have an associate minister or minister for small business, or for skilled trades. And so we're continuously advocating for an associate minister level appointment within the Ministry of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade, in Ontario, perhaps supported by a deputy or an assistant deputy minister, and with like an office representing nonprofits, charities, and social innovation. We think that would go a long way with supporting the sector in all the various things that they're working on right now.
And what else is ONN working on as we head into 2024? What should our listeners be aware of?
Yeah, so we've been at a actually really interesting and exciting time in our organization for the past year, where we've embarked on a strategic planning and thinking process. We've been doing a lot of internal learning and reflection on equity, and reconciliation, and what that means for us as an organization. And what that has meant is a new policy agenda. So we've crafted a brand new one, which we're looking really forward to sharing publicly. And it has some things that folks will recognize. So we'll continue focusing on decent work, volunteer modernization, and preservation expansion of social purpose real estate. We'll also be continuing to do some work around nonprofit sustainability, and data. We've been doing a lot of work around that. We've now actually also explicitly named a couple of new pieces, like circular local economies and a thriving democracy, and anti-privatization of publicly funded services. So we have 9 focus areas now. And again, some of the work we've always been doing, we've just been a bit more explicit about naming it, and we'll be releasing that to the public shortly. But very exciting, and really thinking about, again, what's the public policy environment we need for the sector to thrive, but what are some spaces in which the sector plays a really critical role in moving forward, like economic development, local economies, a thriving democracy, and the anti-privatization of publicly funded services.
Well, Pam, thank you so much for your insight and keen analysis. I just learn so much whenever I speak to you. Your advice for nonprofit professionals and organizations in our audience is so greatly appreciated. Thanks for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thank you for having me and looking forward to continuing our conversations. Thank you.